Good afternoon. My name is Andreas Baker. I'm with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We've called this press conference to announce the conclusions of the International Election Observation Mission to the general elections here in the United States yesterday. There were several institutions involved in this observation mission, so we will proceed with short statements from each of the heads of the mission, and then we'll have an opportunity to answer any questions at the end of that. Following the end of the press conference, the statement, the conclusions, as well as a press release will be available on our websites, as well as in hard copy outside of the room. So I will start by introducing Ms. Christine Mutonen, who is the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, a Member of Parliament in her home country of Austria, and she was appointed as the Special Coordinator and Leader of the Short-Term OSCE Observer Mission. Ms. Mutonen, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome also from my side. Let me immediately come to our conclusions. Our main conclusions are that yesterday's general elections were highly competitive and demonstrated commitment to fundamental freedoms of expression, assembly and association. The presidential campaign was characterized by harsh personal attacks as well as intolerant rhetoric by one candidate. We note that diverse and extensive media coverage allowed voters to make an informed choice. Recent legal changes and decisions on technical aspects of the electoral process were often motivated by partisan interests and added undue obstacles for voters. Suffrage rights are not guaranteed for all citizens, leaving sections of the population without the right to vote. These elections were administered by competent and professional staff, including on election day, which was assessed positively by our observers, despite some instances of long queues and malfunctioning voting equipment. Our observations are based on the work of long-term observers who have been here for a number of weeks, short-time observers, and members of parliament who have personal experience in running in elections. Yesterday, our more than 290 observers visited more than 900 polling stations across the country. The campaign was dynamic and vivid, taking place in an open atmosphere. The two major presidential candidates offered distinct policy alternatives, but as I mentioned, often used highly charged rhetoric and employed personal attacks. Third-party candidates only received minimal attention during the campaign. It is problematic that some 4 million residents of US overseas territories and 600,000 residents of the District of Columbia do not have voting representation in Congress. In addition, more than 6 million convicts are widely deprived of their vote. One of the commitments the United States has made in the OSCE is to provide universal and equal suffrage, and these elements are a contravention of this commitment. We understand that voter identification rules are political device and vary across states. A great deal of litigation on this topic continued up until election day, creating some confusion. Efforts to ensure the integrity of vote are important, but should not lead to the disenfranchisement of eligible voters. In conclusion, yesterday's elections followed a particularly divisive campaign, but Americans took the opportunity in high numbers to freely choose their leadership. Recent legal changes and limitations on some citizens' rights added unnecessary obstacles for voters, but I'm pleased that the casual talk of vote rigging raised during the campaign proved to be just that, talk. There are many more details in our written report. For now, we just want to give you some highlights. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now ask Mr. Makis Voridis, who is the head of the delegation deployed by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and a member of parliament in his home country of Greece.
Thank you, and let me also welcome you here. Now, just adding a few more comments. The team of parliamentarians that I headed included more than 100 people, and we were deployed to 8 states plus the District of Columbia. As elected officials in our countries, we of course have a particular interest and expertise in overseeing elections. Now, a few things stood out for our observers. First, the legal framework as well as administration for elections in the United States is decentralized, with significant variation between states. This includes voter registration, which is active and implemented at the state level. Initiatives have been undertaken to improve voter list accuracy and inclusiveness, including interstate projects to identify inaccuracies. Nevertheless, our observers yesterday noted that in many instances, citizens intending to vote at a polling station were not found on the voter list, underlining systemic concerns with voter registration. The highly decentralized approach to elections here means that it's almost better to think of this as 50 different elections. Even key issues like whether prisoners can vote, on what ID is needed, varies from one state to the next, and this lack of country-wide standard, it is indeed a weakness. In the end, of course, the elections were well run, and even in places where legislation on international observation is ambiguous, we were generally warmly welcomed. So, thank you for your hospitality. I look forward to working within the OSCE PA with my newly elected colleagues from the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The challenges facing both the United States and the wider OSCE region need us to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Then finally, I'll ask Ambassador Audrey Glover, who is the head of the long-term election observation mission deployed by the OSCE ODIHR.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and let me too welcome you to our press conference today. Before I go to our conclusions, I would just like to shortly introduce the work that we have been doing here in the United States over the past week or two. The OSCE ODIHR Election Observation Mission began its work on the 4th of October with 11 experts based here in Washington and 26 long-term observers who have observed the election campaign and preparation across 35 states over the last month. Then last week, we were joined by about 300 short-term observers, including some from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and they observed throughout the country on Election Day. Election Day is an important and very visible part of any election, but an election is much more than just one day. Over the past month, we've been observing all aspects of the electoral process: legal framework, voter registration, campaign and media coverage, and the work of the election administration. I'd like to now just stress 2 points in addition to the general conclusion. On the one hand, as we have already mentioned, the elections were administered by competent and committed staff, and the dynamic campaign was held in an open atmosphere where fundamental freedoms were respected. Voters were able to make an informed choice between candidates competing on a level playing field. Citizens could express their views and engage in political activity. All this is good, and the media is vibrant, if rather polarized and partisan. On the other hand, serious shortcomings remain. When looking at these, we can't forget that the center of any electoral process is the voter. Elections are for the voters. The voter's voice is the very basis upon which democracy has been built. As you've heard already, millions of citizens were disenfranchised and unable to vote in these elections. so their voices were not heard. You have already heard some figures. And of course, we know that voters have to register themselves to take part in an election. And we also know that the efforts have been made by many states to improve this process by sharing information and providing online registration. But when an estimated 35 million citizens are not registered, this is a signal that more needs to be done. We looked closely at practicalities surrounding voting, that is, voter registration, voter identification, the location of polling stations, new voting technologies, and so on. We noticed the tremendous efforts made to accommodate the needs of disabled voters and overseas voters, including the military. These positive steps very much relied on cross-party support. The Electoral Assistance Commission should also be praised for providing a forum for states and counties to share good practices of administering elections and helping improve the voter registration on election day. Much of what we look at appears to be technical, but these elements do have political dimension and a real political impact on voters. The legal framework, as my colleagues have already mentioned, is very decentralized, and elections are run by often different rules in thousands of jurisdictions. Some legal and administrative decisions appear to have had a partisan flavor. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down sections of the Voter Rights Act, thus removing a long-standing and effective safeguard against discrimination, largely affecting African Americans and other minority groups. States then introduced legislation on registration and voter identification, adversely affecting some citizens, including African Americans, Native Americans, and low-income citizens, and their participation in elections. These recent changes also generated a large volume of litigation still ongoing and led to a lack of clarity regarding the rules. Changing the location of polling stations, meaning that some people now have to travel very long distances to a polling station, has probably also reduced voter turnout. These technical issues do have an impact on voters, as they may lead some to disengage from elections and political life in general, and in effect making them voters no more. At the same time, we've seen good practices in many states, and I hope these can be shared across state lines to help deepen the confidence in elections for all citizens of the United States. The fundamental freedoms that the United States citizens enjoy in elections should be acknowledged, cherished, and protected. But to give even fuller scope to these freedoms, efforts should be made to give all citizens the equal opportunity to express their views by casting their ballot on election day. We've much enjoyed our work here in the United States and will stay here to continue observing developments after yesterday's vote. We will prepare a comprehensive final report which will also offer recommendations to improving the electoral process. And the ODIHR will stand ready to assist the United States in the process of following up on our assessment. Let me conclude by thanking you all once again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have limited time, but happy to take a few questions in case there are. Down here, please, if you just state your name and media source. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, Julia Hart with Reuters. OSCE has observed elections in the United States before. I'm wondering what differences you saw in this one, especially any increase in barriers or hurdles that voters faced at the polls, especially in the counties and the states that were formerly covered by the preclearance formula in the Voting Rights Act that was struck down in that Supreme Court decision the ambassador mentioned.
Well, it's not a very good answer to your question insofar as we don't compare one election with another election. no two elections are ever the same, even within the same country, and certainly not between countries. But in relation to your answer, to your question, I would answer by saying that there certainly were some long lines yesterday, and there were problems, as we have explained in some detail, in relation to certain voters being unregistered, disenfranchised. So we did notice that, but by and large, although there were long lines at a lot of polling stations, there was a calm in almost everywhere, and there were really no problems that we could see in relation to election day, other than some difficulty with some of the new voting technologies.
Thank you. Down here, please.
Yes, hello, I'm Paul Schenkman with U.S. News and World Report. Follow-up question and then a second question. Mr. Varadis, you talked about how you were generally welcomed at polling stations. Can you talk about instances where you weren't welcomed, what actually happened, and what was the response? How did you respond? And then more generally, President-elect Donald Trump, in some of his campaign rhetoric leading up to the election, called for vague called for people to go to the polling stations and to observe them. He didn't say explicitly what he wanted to do, but there was a lot of insinuation that this was designed to be a form of voter intimidation. We've seen reports that the level of voter intimidation increased this year versus previous years, or at least the people calling in to say so. I wonder if you observed any instances where there were people who appeared to be either pro-Trump or just generally private citizens who were at voting stations, what kind of activities they undertook, and if you saw any evidence that they were successful in deterring people from voting.
Okay, the first question, which is actually about the international observation, one must know that we were here because we were invited by the State Department. So the US federal government actually invited us for observation. And that is in accordance with international obligations. But there is an issue then, because the way the observation is organized, according to US law, lies with the states. So there are states, still there are states, where you are not allowed, they do not allow for international observation. And in those states, we did not go at all. There are other states which is very clear, well, they do not know they allow, but they organize the international observation. So in these states also we were, there was absolutely no problem, and everywhere we are warmly welcomed. There's a third, let's say, category of states where, well, they do not prohibit, but it's not clear whether they allow. So there is maybe a legal ambiguity there. In general, even in these states where there could be some differences in the approach that the election officials took, we were very, very warmly welcomed. And I must say that, you know, they were people who were proud of their work and they wanted to show their work, and, you know, that was the general idea. There were instances, and we have noted some. Sometimes the international observers were not fully allowed to observe. By not fully allowed, we usually mean instances where we could ask for specific information and the official would not give, or the place where the observers were allowed to see, they did not have a clear view of the process. But I must say that there were some cases, but the vast majority does not characterized by that. Now, were there any instances of intimidation? With the reports we have, I don't know, very few of such events. We can't say that, and these were more, you know, kind of interpretations or problems where how close the poster should be, whether they should be here or there. Someone got in a polling station with his leaflets and all that, and they asked him to go out, and he was, you know, but little minor incidents. We did not see, let's say, a wave of intimidation in the polls that we've worked and we've observed.
I just can agree. So we didn't observe any intimidation. There were those people campaigning in front of the polling stations, but most of them, so this was just single events, they kept the distance they had to keep, which is legal. So some of them even had a line on the pavement, so we are not crossing the line. Here we stop with campaigning. So we didn't find any intimidation, and I thought we were very well welcomed. People were very glad, even, and proud to show how well they were organized in the polling stations, and they led us around to see how well the whole thing went. Of course, sometimes there were those queues, and in some stations we found the technical equipment maybe was old, so it didn't work properly, but they all managed to continue with the elections.
And just to add, we have not had very many reports at all from our long-term observers about any intimidation. So one can assume that the threats, just didn't take place. There were, of course, as well, people from the Department of Justice who were in various polling stations around the country. That might have had an effect on stopping any intimidation, but it really wasn't an issue as far as any of us experienced.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? That's great. It sounds like we've been very clear. Thank you for your time. So as mentioned, the statement as well as an accompanying press release are available on our website, and there will be a few hard copies outside. Thank you very much.